Welcome to the Political Checkmate, and today I am checkmating David Pakman's video called The Myth of Defensive Gun Ownership. So here we go.
A lot of talk from the pro-gun crowd, the more guns in every instance crowd, that defensive gun ownership and defensive gun usage is a really significant thing. And there's a really interesting article by former guest Evan D. Philippus and Devin Hughes at Politico that talks about what they describe as the myth of gun ownership. The myth being that millions of gun owners successfully use their firearms to defend themselves and their families from criminals. And as Evan and Devin have figured out, there is no academic support in public health literature for this myth. This myth
A literature review of defensive gun uses by the National Academies of Science in 2013 found that out of 300,000 violent crimes, there are about 500,000 to more than 3 million defensive gun uses. But if you were to use the 108,000 defensive gun use figure from the National Crime Victimization Survey, Gary Kleck's book Armed, Chapter 6, shows how the National Crime Victimization Survey undercounts defensive gun uses. First, it does not count no harm cases. Second is that the survey never directly asks about defensive gun uses. And third is that the National Crime Victimization Survey is part of the federal government, and people are cautious giving out the information of defensive gun uses because they might go to court due to how tricky the legal system of defensive gun use works. I have to say, it is not surprising that the National Crime Victimization Survey undercounts defensive gun uses because they also undercount spousal abuse and rape. I would recommend you to read the book because it goes into much more detail.
is the single largest motivation for gun ownership, according to a Gallup study. So when we talk about why does it matter if people incorrectly believe that millions of guns are used defensively successfully every year, it matters because it is the number one cited reason for gun ownership, according to a Gallup study. So the myth comes from, back in 1992, Gary Kleck and Mark Getz, who are criminologists at Florida State University. They did a random digital dial survey to establish how many defensive gun uses there are in the United States. And when I tell you how they did it, you will realize how ridiculous it is. They surveyed 5,000 people, asking them, have you used a firearm in self-defense in the last year? And if so, what was the reason and what was the effect of using the firearm? 66 incidents of defensive gun use were reported from the sample of 5,000. The researchers then just took those findings and extrapolated them to suggest that between 1 and 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year is a fair number to estimate. This has now turned into gospel for gun advocates who talk about how much guns are used defensively. And if I don't have to explain it to you because you already get why that's an absurd claim to make based on that study, then I'm glad. But I know that there will be people who don't realize why this is so absurd.
Actually, the defensive gun use is 222. It is not an insane figure to get high defensive gun use estimates from the study because pro-gun control criminologist Marvin Wolfgang praised the study for its methodology and cautioned it does. Other studies have reached similar conclusions to the high estimates of the Kleck study, such as a survey done by the National Institute of Justice, and Kleck has also shown that the CDC survey data has also helped prove high defensive gun use.
So I'll explain it to them as Evan D. Philippus and Devin Hughes do in this Politico article. Okay. 1997, David Hemingway, a professor of health policy at the Harvard School of Public Health, offered the first kind of rebuttal to this so-called research. First, there is something called the social desirability bias, which is that respondents would falsely claim that their gun has been used for its intended purpose to ward off a criminal to validate their initial purchase. A respondent might also exaggerate facts to say that a use of a firearm was a so-called defensive use when in reality it was not. And again, you're just asking people. There is nothing actually linking the claims from individuals to any actual records of such defensive gun use. Second,
Gary Kleck has responded to the Hemingway response. They pointed out that in the original paper, the respondents' accounts had unheroic character.
there's this problem of gun owners responding strategically. There are millions of members of the NRA in the United States and other gun groups. They are probably all aware of the debate around guns. So they would have a reason that they would exaggerate or straight up lie about defensive gun use.
Kleck has responded to that argument by pointing out that interviewers did not know about the researcher's view on defensive gun use, and Hemingway has not claimed he has contacted the interviewers. The problem with this argument of creating a story of defensive gun use is not a simple process of yes or no, rather it is 19 logical, consistent responses, and if one fails the process, it gets rejected. In fact, the original paper talked about how Kleck is doing a double checking after the process and him scrubbing out the flawed responses.
Number three is the risk of false positives from something called telescoping, which is where respondents might recall an actual self-defense use that's outside the time frame. So some of these 5,000 respondents, 66 of whom said they were involved in a defensive gun use, they were asked, have you had a defensive gun use in the last year? And if they actually had a gun use that was defensive a year and a half prior, that would be telescoping and it would drastically skew the data, especially when it's being extrapolated to the entire population of the country. These are the sorts of biases, Lewis, which make the study worthless.
Kleck has accounted telescoping in the original paper to probably inflate the estimates by 21%. I want to address one more argument from David Hemingway, that wounded criminals would get medical treatment. Therefore, the criminals who got shot prove the estimates of defensive gun crime is low. Well, Gary Kleck has responded to the argument by pointing out that wounds can be treated by amateurs and that there are crimes that are unsolved, and also the situation these prison inmates are in, they have an incentive to lie to not increase their sentences. I would also like to point out you can simply show your gun and not fire it, and the criminals would run away. That way, you can still have a high defensive gun use. Anyway, you should also realize there is a term called false negative, where they miss stuff. You can get a false negative with telescoping because of memory loss or failures of reporting. Gary Kleck has pointed out the possibility of false negatives estimates through things like carrying a gun illegally, forgetfulness, higher age threshold of 18 or older compared to the National Crime Victimization Survey that covers ages 12 and older. The survey assumes one defensive gun use per person, and they used phone calls in the 90s. Not everyone had a phone back then, so they missed poor communities.
And when you look at the complete lack of rigor, scientific rigor that's applied here, you say, okay, it's pretty obvious to me, but we'll just ignore that study. But then the so-called study is touted as gospel by groups like the NRA and so many others. And when you say a lie often enough, it becomes the truth in the minds of so many.
That's true, and it doesn't help when gun owners or people who want to be gun owners are watching the news, and all they hear about and see is there's a murder here, there's a shooting there, robbery here, violent crime there. It adds to this climate of fear, and people think they need guns because of that. I just got into it with an employee of mine who has two young kids, mind you, keeps two shotguns under the bed, guns in the nightstands. Her life is just completely governed by fear, but she's never had to use these guns, of course, and she probably never will.
And
Okay, a person may not use a gun in self-defense in a lifetime. It does not mean they should not have a gun because it deters criminals and is one of the best tools in self-defense. They can get less injury and stolen property, according to the National Academies of Science. And also, I want to point out how bad this person's logic is. Just because I will never use a fire extinguisher does not mean I should not have a fire extinguisher, because it is one of the best tools to help distinguish a fire. In a later video, I am going to respond to a video by Pakman arguing that guns are not useful in self-defense. This is the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and please donate to my Patreon so I can make more videos and have your video requests checkmated. And thanks for watching, and have a nice day.